Joining me now is the Director of Public Policy at Christian Schools Australia, Mark Spencer. Mark, thanks for your time. You must be disappointed with the outcome today.
I think people of faith across Australia are bitterly disappointed by the outcome from this parliament. This whole conflicted campaign we've had since 2018 of trying to link religious freedom and protections for people of faith with complex provisions in the Sex Discrimination Act in a way that just simply doesn't reflect reality.
Can you elaborate on what you're saying there in terms of not reflecting reality? Because I guess the concerns go to specifically single-sex schools, Mark.
Well, the concerns are the whole campaign trying to link the provisions of the Sex Discrimination Act to current exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act are based on a campaign of lies started back in 2018 prior to the release of the expert panel report on religious freedom, where there were claims made that gay students were being expelled in schools across Australia, which simply isn't true. And that's created this sort of climate of fear, climate of concern amongst students and others in the community, understandable concern when you've got those lies being pushed, that there's a sudden need to make changes to legislation that's been in place since 2013. There's been no evidence that it's actually resulted in students being expelled. And that's not something that we've indicated Christian schools have ever done. Now, for some reason, political reasons, part of this concerted campaign, that's tried to be linked with the protections for religious discrimination. And they're completely separate issues, as we've said all along. And the changes to the Sex Discrimination Act are complex. And as we've found out today, it needs expert review, not something to be rushed through in the dead of night by Parliament.
I guess one of the challenges, though, for the other side of the debate is that this has been left to the 11th hour of the Parliament. In a perfect world, you would have liked this discussed with more time and with bipartisanship, Mark.
Absolutely, and that's what we've been pushing for throughout this Parliament. And we've made it clear that we support the Australian Law Reform Commission process. Now, we support the review of those exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act by an appropriate body. They are outdated. They reflect a way of crafting law that relates back to 1984 when the Sex Discrimination Act was first put in place. They're provisions that do need to be updated and modernised. And the Law Reform Commission is the body to be able to do that. That's what those commissions are there for. And we've since had expert panel reviews. We've got a Law Reform Commission ready to do some work. We've had 2 parliamentary inquiries, pass the Religious Discrimination Bill. And despite all that expert advice, Parliament has still, in the wee small hours this morning, just trashed that and put in place a package that's unacceptable and has these problems.
Why was the removal of that particular section of the Sex Discrimination Act such a concern to you, and how would it have a material impact in terms of what's being taught in Christian schools?
Well, if you look back to the history back to 2018, 2019, this is effectively Wong 2.0. The bill introduced by Senator Wong back in 2018 replicated in this amendment. And as the 2 parliamentary inquiries that looked at those provisions then came to realise, this is complex legislation. Simply striking out that subsection impacts the ability of any faith-based school to teach a view of sexuality and gender and marriage and morality that reflects their beliefs. Now, these are pretty fundamental beliefs for all of the monotheistic faiths. Christian schools, Catholic schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools, all have views around appropriate sexual conduct, be that heterosexual or homosexual. And those views, under this proposed amendment, it would have been very doubtful whether we could continue to teach those within our schools.
So, Mark, how does a Christian school deal with the sensitive situation of a child that might come out as gay or say, transgender?
In the same way they've been dealing with them for many years. Obviously, students around with gender identity issues has been a much more recent phenomenon, and we've seen the explosion of that becoming an issue in society and the increasing number of referrals for support in that area. But same-sex attraction has been an issue that schools have been dealing with for decades, and they'll deal with it in a very sensitive, very caring, very pastoral way on a case-by-case basis, with the student in question, with the family, reflecting the needs of other students in that cohort, reflecting the context of their school community and how that's going to be worked out in a way that's in the best interest of that child within that school context, and also cognizant of the conscientious objections that some of my people have around, for example, the gender identity issue, around the use of pronouns that they may find offensive to use.
Mark, finally, what would you say to the critique that now that this bill likely won't pass before the election, that it's a solution looking for a problem, and essentially the status quo remains anyway now, Mark Spencer? But what do you say to the suggestion that this is a solution looking for a problem, not needed?
Well, the religious discrimination bill is clearly needed. There's lots of evidence of that. There's been evidence put to the parliamentary inquiries around that. There's been public surveys done and polling done. It's indicated that a significant number of people of faith in Australia are suffering from discrimination. We had an example of one of our schools only last week that was refused the ability to hire from a hire company that's used for nearly 2 decades, that they were just simply refused, they wouldn't hire to them anymore because of what they perceived as their beliefs. Now, that's straight out religious discrimination. These things do happen. These are day-to-day occurrences for people of faith around the country. Talk to some of my Islamic friends and they'll tell you about the experience, particularly of Islamic women. These are desperately needed provisions. Now, we're happy to have the ALRC look at the review of the Sex Discrimination Act provisions. We're happy for that to start immediately we get this religious discrimination bill passed. And we still think there is hope. There are only those 2 days, as your story indicated, but with clear bipartisan support, with clear commitment from both the government and the opposition, and an open dialogue between them, we think that still might be possible.